Yeah, very good to be here, to be doing my little bit to bring something into the Ipswich Sangha, and it's always a pleasure to just get around. And I'm finding something I'm actually enjoying about this period of so much limitation on travel. That actually, in some ways, I've travelled more virtually than I even do in my real life, despite the fact that yes, I've been a regular visitor to America, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries for probably the last 30 or so years of my older life. But now here I'm in Ipswich. And what a strange time to be here, to be talking about the theme of radiating love. What an evening, what a few days that we're going through, where the possibility of being true to that precept, that maxim, that motto, whatever you want to call it, of Dhardo Rimpoche's, to radiate love. The idea of radiation is something, well, like the sun, it's dispassionate. It doesn't choose. It doesn't it doesn't select. The sun shines on everyone, just as the rain falls on everyone. And so, to take to heart the precept, radiate love, the third of Dhardo Rinpoche's precepts or mottos for his school in Kalimpong, every now and then gets tested. And if we find ourselves in the Hillary Clinton camp thinking of baskets of deplorables, or if perhaps you're on the other side of the spectrum, the awful denizens of CNN and the failing New York Times, don't know which side of the divide you're all on, but this is a time to be really thinking hard about this challenge to radiate love, not just to feel it for a few friends or a lover or two or three, but to radiate love. So quite a challenge to practice it, quite a challenge to think about it, even a challenge, to talk about it. But I'll do my best. And one way I want to talk about it is by talking about Dhardo Rinpoche. I don't know, whether in these other talks that you've had on these three mottos, whether someone else has said much about Dhardo Rinpoche, but I will say a little bit. And Kasha Prabha mentioned my visits to that beautiful retreat centre on the Coromandel Peninsula of New Zealand. They acquired land, about 240 acres of land in this amazing area of natural bush on a hill overlooking the sea. And unlike Subhuti, when they acquired land in Spain, they immediately threw together huts so that they could run retreats. The New Zealanders, particularly under the visionary leadership of Satyananda, built a 30-foot high stupa, the biggest stupa in the movement. And it's where, some of Dhardo Rinpoche's ashes are laid to rest, like other stupas that we have around the movement. I think I've visited and circumambulated them all. But something I love about going to that retreat centre or to any of these retreat centres is to spend time, as it were, with Dhardo Rinpoche. Obviously, I'd heard about him because Sangharakshita would talk about him in his lectures, or if we were on a study seminar with him, some of his anecdotes about his time in India and living in Kalimpong inevitably brought Dhardo Rinpoche to mind, this man who had been a friend of Sangharakshita's, a close friend of his. Dhardo Rinpoche was a High Lama, the 13th incarnation of the abbot of a monastery in Tibet, but who, for various reasons, obviously not least because of the Chinese invasion, at this stage of his life, and for the rest of his life, was running a very, very small school for refugee children, mainly Tibetan, but not entirely Tibetan children. In Kalimpong, a sort of border town between India and Sikkim and Bhutan and Tibet, up in that area in the northeast of India. Once, when discussing the Bodhisattva ideal and the Bodhisattva ordination on a study seminar, Rakshita said that he had taken the Bodhisattva vow, but he'd never wanted to take it unless he could take it and have it witnessed by somebody who he believed to be a living bodhisattva. And of course, the Tibetan world is full of claims, for the bodhisattvahood of all the various teachers. And Sangharakshita, many of them very, very well known, still well known, even if they're now dead. But he said that the only person of whom he felt absolutely confident that he was a bodhisattva was Dhardo Rimpoche. So that was quite a trailer. That was quite a teaser for the possibility of meeting this man. I'd been on a tour with Sangharakshita through Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh in 1982. Sangharakshita gave about 30 talks to the Dalit community, the recent or relatively recent converts to Buddhism from their Hindu status as untouchables under the leadership of Dr. Ambedkar. And this was a 3-month tour, traveling and living, very closely with Bhante and a number of his Indian, our Indian brothers and sisters, as well as a few Brits and Kiwis on the trip. But when Sangharakshita left to go back to England, I decided to make my way to Kalimpong to see if I could meet Dhardo Rimpoche, which I did. In those days, in 1982, you couldn't just go straight to Kalimpong. You had to go to Darjeeling to get you had to go to Calcutta to get a permit to go to Darjeeling, and then in Darjeeling you had to get a permit to go to Kalimpong, and you were allowed just 48 hours there. And I went through the rigmarole, so it was quite an extended trip for those sorts of reasons. But eventually I got by jeep, a rather frightening 2-hour jeep ride from Darjeeling to Kalimpong, and got there sort of early morning one day, and realized that I didn't know the address of this school. I don't know why, but I'd had this idea of Kalimpong being like a tiny village, and it would be obvious, where this school, the ITBCI, the Indo-Tibetan Cultural Institute School, would be. And I wandered around what actually turned out to be a much bigger town than I'd realized, which was like Darjeeling, crammed with schools. Being a hill station, it was the kind of place where the slightly more well-off Indians would send their kids, to school. And so there were these rather sort of English influenced schools, often with English staff or people highly influenced by the Brits, and loads of kids in uniforms walking around the town. It was the time that people were going to school when I was wandering around, and there were just crocodiles and gangs of children, all in their uniforms in every direction. And I was asking people, ITBCI school, for a start, they probably didn't understand my accent, let alone, have an idea of where the school was. Sometimes to Tibetans, I'd say Dhardo Rimpoche, and they would bow profusely, but they couldn't explain to me where the school was. And then I saw coming along the street, this gang of children who were different to all the others. They weren't sort of looking like they were reluctant to go to school. They weren't in very starched and tight uniforms. They did have a uniform, navy blue and orange, but they looked so cheerful, so happy. And it was, my intuition just shouted, this is it. And I went up to one of them. They were only about 7 or 8 years old. I went up to this little girl, I said, Dhardo Rimpoche. And she literally grabbed my hand, and a little boy grabbed my other hand, laughing, and just took me to the school. It was such a fabulous introduction to Dhardo Rinpoche. I mean, it was recognizable. His influence, whatever it was he radiated, had allowed me to see that the children who went to the school that he was running were different to any of the others. This really rather magical meeting with these kids who didn't even need to they recognized me, I recognized them, and the next thing I knew, I was at the school. But as I've said, I was there at the time that school was starting, which I guess because of the jeep journey and everything, probably wasn't 9 o'clock. Maybe it was something more like 10, I don't know. But I arrived at the school, and asked around. There were members of the staff, and they said, "Oh well, Rinpoche is not available at the moment. He'll be out in an hour or two." So I didn't know what was going on. I realize now that he was doing his morning's meditation and his various practices. Every morning he had a very, very substantial regime of practice. One of which if you've read Suvadra's wonderful book, The Wheel and the Diamond, his life of Dhardo Rimpoche, one of his practices was to spend 40 minutes brushing his teeth while visualizing himself as a bull-headed demon. So this gives maybe another angle on Dhardo Rinpoche. But I was just in the dark and sat down in his office for a while, waiting. And his office was a kind of Aladdin's cave of his desk with the sort of school books and so on, but also this wonderful image of Tara in a glass case with her mantra revolving round and round in circles, powered by the heat from a candle that just made the mantra revolve in its glass case. Just this wonderful room, quite dark, quite gloomy, but with these highlights here and there, and the sort of clutter of Dhardo Rinpoche's work as a teacher, headmaster, and founder of the school. In the end, I decided to just get on with what I'd come for, because I didn't know how long I would have. My idea had been to make a film on sort of Super 8mm, those were the days, just a home movie of the school and of Dhardo Rinpoche to the extent I could. So I asked one of the teachers, Jampal Kalden, whether I could just get up and do that, and he said, of course. So I went into one of the classrooms and just started filming, the children doing their thing, and the teachers walking around. And at some point, Rinpoche came into the room. He'd obviously finished his day's practice, and it was the most extraordinary meeting. I mean, to this day, I don't know how we did it, because instantly we came together like two old friends. Two old school friends. It was like we were both almost like kids. I had this bag full of tape recorders, cameras, cine cameras, film. And we were going through the bag, and I was showing him things, and we were having this whole conversation about how I was obviously a spy. And then I think, hang on, he didn't speak English and I didn't speak Tibetan or Hindi. How were we doing that? I have no idea. All I know is that's what we were doing. It was like instantly we met like playmates. This wonderful sense of just immediately being seen in a really good way, and met in this really simple, lovely, warm, friendly way, as almost like two boys playing together. The kids in the room, just obviously loved him. He was, I suppose, the headmaster, but there was no sense of people being cowed by his authority. They obviously just looked on him with such love and such warmth, and he with them. He carried no airs of authority or strictness. I mean, he obviously really cared for them, and I suspect that if necessary, he could read the Riot Act. But what was really obvious was like this continuation of what I'd seen in the kids on the street, that this was a world in which these kids just felt a constant flow of love and care from him. At one point, as we went from one building to another, and there weren't many buildings. I mean, in those days, this school was an incredibly ramshackle affair. Most of the buildings had gaps in the roof and gaps in the walls. There was just one good building that had been funded by a Canadian charity. But as we made our way from one building to another, we came across a girl just sitting. She must have been about 6. She was very, very young, just sitting on the ground crying. And I don't know why. Everyone else was in their classroom, and Dhardo went up to the girl, and just squatted down next to her, and he just talked to her for a while, and she talked to him, and he talked to her, and then somehow he pulled out from his robes a small blackboard. He's famous for, like, Harpo Marx having all kinds of things hidden in his robes. Out came a little blackboard and chalk, and he started drawing pictures on it. And after a few minutes of this, he and the girl were talking, and she was smiling and laughing, and eventually, he took her by the hand, and we walked together to her classroom, and he handed her over, and it was just such a delightful thing to see. This, something that I it was sort of, in that case, it felt paternal, but a lot of the time when I was with him, what I felt coming from him towards me, I mean, when I look back on it, there was something maternal about it. There was something of this sense of, throughout all out, in the Tibetan world, this idea that at some point everyone has been our mother. And it was as if I think I just get the impression he must have meditated on that, so much that it was as if that quality was alive in him. And I think what I picked up from him, and in a way it's sort of something I guess I want to get across about him, is the love that radiated from him, was something utterly embodied. That was not something willfully created, like doing metta practice and trying to will oneself to, may they be happy, may they be well. It was based on an absolutely unconditional recognition of a common humanity. From the standpoint, yes, of a quality of consciousness that is, on the one hand, still human, but on the other hand is a bit outside the game, able to see the poignancy of the human condition. I think the kind of quality of metta that he embodied was one of instant fellow feeling, instant capacity for empathy. I felt it. I thought I was just going to have one meeting with him for an hour or two. He knew that, as a Westerner visiting Kalimpong, I only had a small amount of time. And when we'd finished talking, for a couple of hours, he immediately said, well, you must stay for lunch. And then at the end of lunch, he said, well, we must talk more. We ended up over the course of the 2 days that I was allowed to stay in town for about 12 hours. Long after I'd run out of cassettes and my cassette recorder. But again, magically, he opened a drawer and found one cassette, which he was able to give me. People who visited him told me that it was as if when you were there, it was all about you. He only was interested in you and your needs. Several people, told the story of having got back to their hotel, and there really was only one kind of hotel that people stayed at, the Deki Lodge. It's coming to my head as I speak. He'd paid, he'd arranged to have the bill paid for them, and they would discover, and this is somebody who I was to discover had effectively no money. We spent I was still there by the evening of that first day, and part of his work that evening was to talk to a carpenter who was doing some work on one of the classrooms. And it was, in that position, just seeing him without understanding a word of it, just very capably, obviously discussing a project with a carpenter and working out what to do. And when we got back to his room, we talked about the state of the school and the finances. It turned out that the charity that had been supporting them for a while and that had paid for that building was no longer able to pay for anything. And I said, so how are you being supported? Because it turned out the Indian government wouldn't support the school because they taught more than the Indian syllabus. It wasn't that they taught less or a different syllabus, they taught more. They taught the proper syllabus plus Tibetan folklore, language, etc., etc. And for that reason, they didn't get a government grant. So I said, well, how are you supported? And he said, well, people from, your community, Sangharakshit's disciples, have been very generous. And I knew for a fact, Harsha Prabhu will remember it, there was a big sweet jar in one of our rooms, like a swear box, where we would put pennies, and Ashvajit, would collect them up and send the money to Dhardo Rimpoche. And that was how he was trying to support this school. And I'd by then been with him for 12 hours. All he'd done was talk to me about his life story, about the Dharma, about Tara, never once he said, and by the way, we need help. It was the most extraordinary, again, he even though, he must have known that I was, potentially, a bridge towards help, because I was only about the second or third person who visited him from our movement. He was just too preoccupied with what I needed and what I wanted and how he could help me to kind of use the opportunity to look after the school. It was extraordinary. This capacity he had, was, I think, an absolute embodiment of, I guess, the love of Amitabha. I mean, he talked a lot. He was very associated with Tara, and through Tara, through to the whole Lotus family. And one felt in him the sort of a love, the Amitabha warmth and the sort of basis of Amitabha's compassion and the compassion, in the whole Lotus family, which is that dimension of the Buddhist compassion, of course, which is, you see on the one hand, that we're all really just conditioned beings. We're not that different from each other. We're all subject to the same conditioning. And because we are so completely run by our conditioning, there's very little you can call a self in the middle of it. In fact, there isn't anything you can call a self in the middle of it. And yet, here we each are, making our own unique, poignant way through the web of the human condition. And, sometimes with success, sometimes with failure. But it's that wisdom that, while knowing that in a sense, yes, like the Bodhisattva in the Diamond Sutra, all beings, don't really exist. All beings are empty. On the other hand, we do have our dreams, we do have our hopes, we have our successes, we have our failures, we have our joy, we have our suffering. And each of us uniquely, despite the extent to which our conditioning is so off the peg, within each of us, is something highly individual, highly specific. And Dhardo Rinpoche's wisdom was one that could hold the big picture and come from the big picture, and yet absolutely connect and identify with the specificity of each person's unique experience. And that's what I felt coming off him towards me. Yes, I knew he was a 13th incarnation of a High Lama, and we discussed that aspect of his life and who he was, extensively. But all the time, I felt that what was happening was that he was talking to me. Just concerned that I understood him, concerned that, I tried out another, I must stay and have Tibet, a proper Tibetan meal this evening. You must try butter tea, which I did. And I don't think I've known anyone who's enjoyed it, but the experience itself of drinking it with him was absolute bliss. All the time, just feeling this sense of being with somebody, so kind of big in one way, able to talk about the Dharma and clearly just embody something, and yet the way the way it transmitted was through this absolute purity of warmth and love. I asked him at one point in our conversation whether he was particularly concerned that, particularly pleased if a child from his school went on to become a monk or a nun. And he said, well, I don't mind whether they become a monk or a bank manager, so long as they're happy and so long as they're wholehearted in what they do. You know, for him, that was what really mattered, that each person found their way of living their own life as wholeheartedly as they could. And again, you know, to me, that's a reflection of that kind of love that he radiated. It was something that was very much a kind of, you know, it was obviously, in a sense, profoundly wise, that capacity to really immediately find empathy with everyone in whatever their condition, and yet it was coming, you know, it was also so human, so warm. When we parted, it's really interesting, you know, I'd been there for, well, less than 2 days. You know, I'd arrived, you know, we'd had the afternoon and evening together on the first day and quite a lot of the second day. And then I had to get the Jeep back to Darjeeling. But as we parted, it was strange. It was in the way you might feel you're parting from a really close friend who's moving abroad and who you won't see for a long time, maybe never again. It wasn't like, here's this person I've met, and how interesting. You know, that was a nice way to spend a few hours. We both stood there a bit lost for words, and I could see his, you know, both of us were sort of moist-eyed, even tearful. I just found it absolutely extraordinary to spend that kind of time with somebody who radiated love in that way. I got back to Kalimpong and I was staying in the youth hostel, and there was an Anglo-Indian, young Anglo-Indian, who was also visiting India and visiting Darjeeling, because that's where the youth hostel was. And he'd been there, you know, a few days earlier before I left, and we talked over a meal, I guess. And so he'd known that I was going to go to Kalimpong to meet a Tibetan Lama. And we were sitting in this sort of dining area at the youth hostel, and he said, so did you meet your Lama? In a slightly sort of supercilious sort of way. And I said, yes, I did. He said, well, how was it? And I thought for a while, and I said, the best way I can say what it was like was to say that meeting that man has forced me to revise my understanding of what it means to be human. It really was that challenging, that profound, you know, to encounter somebody who, yes, if he was around now, you know, he's been dead for quite a while. If he was around now and in Britain or in America, he would be somebody who would be just really interested, really affectionately interested in everyone's experience, no matter what side of the divide they're on. You know, that he would have that same kind of way of going, that was something he'd say quite often as he looked at people or considered something. He'd go, you know, something really sort of sweet, loving. It just seemed to ooze from him. Sangharakshita's a different kettle of fish. I mean, they lived around each other and they did have a friendship. And there's no time, you know, but I could say a little bit more about that. But I once, in a conversation with Sangharakshita, some years later, we weren't talking about Dhardo Rimpoche. Somehow accidentally, I'd stumbled on saying something which kind of referred to the fact that he could seem a bit cool, offhand, not all the time, you know, but often. You know, I can remember a friend of mine when we were living at Marjamaloka with Banti in Birmingham, you know, for some years. You know, it was just Dhamarati who said, you know, sometimes, you know, you can be around Banti and he's so warm and so friendly, and sometimes you'll pass, you know, in a corridor and he'll look at you as if to say, do I know you? Bhante had this capacity to be, maybe a little bit cruel at times. And this came up in our conversation, and Bhante, I hadn't meant to do it, but I just meant, I said this to Bhante, and he said, it's such a shame. He said, I can sometimes be woken up out of my sleep by a force field of metta that's like a vast golden river running through me. But I've been cursed with a personality that doesn't seem to be so good at communicating it all the time. And it was just a terribly poignant, touching thing for Bhante to say. And I do believe it, even though as his publisher for 25 years, I was on the receiving end probably of more of his pernicketiness and impatience and frustration than any other order member I could mention. But I think it's true. I think not everybody has a personality that can show it. But on the other hand, you look at how Sangharakshita spent the last 40 or 50 years of his life, and I don't think there's any question as to what he was motivated by in terms of his care for people. But I think that's quite important to notice, that Dhardo Rimpoche did have a personality, at least when I met him, that really did, very, very visibly, palpably, and constantly transmit that radiating sort of metta, that radiating quality of being interested, curious, ready to meet you, and really meet you in your heart. To say meet you in your depth starts to sound a bit fancy. Probably he did, but it was more like he would meet you heart to heart and instantly. I think, Sangharakshita had that quality, but in a different way. And as something to aspire to, I think, say when I do the Metta Bhavana, or if I think of, Donald Trump around now, for example, as I have at other times, for example, I think it's enough sometimes to just imagine that, like me, he's breathing. I don't need to do anything fancier than that. I don't have to sort of drill into my brain saying, may he be well, may he be happy. It's enough to just think, do you know what? He probably wants to be happy too. Probably, like me, he doesn't want to suffer. Just to kind of remember those really simple things. And I think this quality of, of radiating love, is something that only we can have the knack of being simple about it, of just being ready to acknowledge that we're all on this strange journey. It's a ridiculous, weird miracle that we're all alive, making our way through whatever this thing is, this life is together. And to just spend time contemplating that, I think, is the trigger for that quality of empathy, of fellow feeling that, over time and with kind of, with focus, will manifest as a love that radiates in all directions towards all beings. Because in a way, it can't do anything. If we get out of the way, it's got nowhere else to go. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you.